It's just too much for you to handle. Maman, we need to be the ones making decisions for the family's future now. My daughter Catherine's voice, so reasonable, so measured. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a verdict, delivered with the gentle finality of a doctor explaining a terminal illness. Those words, spoken across the polished surface of my mother's Thanksgiving table, still find me some nights. They drift in on the Pacific fog that rolls past my window here in Victoria. A ghost from a life that feels a world away. But back then, just 3 months before that Thanksgiving, none of us could see the rot spreading beneath the floorboards of our perfect family portrait. It was still the golden summer. The last golden summer. As it turns out, it began, as every August long weekend did, with the familiar crunch of tires on the long, winding gravel driveway leading to the cottage. From the porch, I could smell the dust mix with the sharp, clean scent of pine needles baking in the sun. Voila, that was the smell of arrival. The smell of peace. My husband, Arthur, had bought this land, 50 acres of raw, windswept Canadian Shield, when we were young and impossibly poor, paying for it with years of overtime from the factory. He built the cottage himself, board by board, his love hammered into every joint. It wasn't a palace, just a sprawling cedar cabin with a wide, welcoming porch and a stone fireplace that could swallow a man whole. It was our sanctuary. The screen door slammed, and my granddaughter, Chloe, bounded up the steps to wrap me in a hug that smelled of sunscreen and youthful energy. Grand Mère, I missed this place. Her smile was genuine, a rare flash of uncomplicated joy. Behind her, the rest of them spilled out of the oversized SUV. My son, Liam, gave me a tired, one-armed hug. His shoulders slumped under a weight I could never quite name. He carried his worn guitar case like it was a vital organ, his eyes already drifting towards the calm, gray water of the lake. Then came Catherine, my cat, and her husband, Mark. They moved with a different energy, a city energy that never seemed to fully dissipate. Even here, Kat was already framing a shot with her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. Chloe, darling, stand by the hydrangeas, and try to look, naturally windswept. Mark clapped his hands together, his voice a little too loud in the quiet air. Another year in paradise. Eleanor just gets more beautiful every time. He kissed my cheek, but his eyes were scanning the shoreline, the boathouse, the property lines. He wasn't seeing a home, he was seeing an asset. I knew that look. It was the same look the developers had in their eyes. Their brochures full of glass and steel monstrosities they called waterfront estates. The final car to arrive carried my brother-in-law, Richard, Arthur's younger brother. He moved slower, his face a roadmap of quiet resentments. He handed me a bottle of cheap wine with a thin smile. For you, Eleanor, still holding down the fort. I see. Arthur would be proud. There was always a lit. The silence at the breakfast table the next morning was a living thing. It was heavier than the humid August air, thick with the things left unsaid after I had shut Mark down. The only sounds were the aggressive scrape of his knife spreading butter on a piece of toast and the chirping of a blue jay outside. Oblivious to the human drama within, Kat was staring into her mug of coffee as if it held all the answers, her thumb tracing the rim in a repetitive, anxious loop. Liam had made himself a bowl of cereal and then vanished, his chair pushed neatly back under the table, a quiet retreat from a battle he wanted no part of. Even the familiar, comforting smell of bacon frying felt like a charade, a desperate attempt to pretend this was just another lazy cottage morning. Richard was the only one who seemed entirely at ease. He hummed a tuneless little melody, catching my eye over the rim of his own mug. He offered a small, conspiratorial wink, as if we were both spectators at a particularly interesting play. It made my skin crawl. My mind kept replaying the scene from the night before, trying to make sense of the ugly desperation I'd heard in their voices. I had walked down to the dock after dinner, seeking a moment of peace. The moon was a perfect silver dollar in the inky sky, and the water was a sheet of black glass, disturbed only by the frantic zigzagging of waterstriders. I'd wanted to feel Arthur's presence there, in the solid feel of the weathered planks he had laid with his own hands. Instead, I found them, Kat and Mark, standing at the very end of the dock, believing they were alone. Their voices were sharp, cutting whispers that carried perfectly over the still water. Don't tell me it's a dip. Mark, the payment for the Range Rover lease is 2 weeks late. And Visa just called about the credit line for the Kitchen Reno post being maxed out. Kat's voice was stripped of its online warmth. It was thin and brittle with panic. The flooring company sent a final notice. It was a calculated risk. Mark's voice was defensive, strained. The coin was supposed to go to the moon. It's not my fault the whole market tanked. I can't control global economics. Catherine. But you could control telling me you'd leveraged our entire line of credit on it. My God, what am I supposed to tell my followers? That our authentic Muskoka life is a complete and utter lie funded by my mother's pity and maxed out credit cards? My brand is built on this. On this place. People don't want to follow someone who's failing. We're not failing. We're re-strategizing. He'd shot back, his voice low and dangerous. And part of that strategy is sitting right up there in that cabin. That's not a house, Kat. It's a winning lottery ticket. We just have to convince her to cash it in. A small piece. That's all we need to get clear. She'll never do it, Kat had murmured, her fight seeming to drain out of her, replaced by a weary resignation. You heard her at dinner. It's all about Arthur's legacy. It's like he's still here, haunting every rock and tree. Then we have to be smarter, Mark had said, his tone shifting, becoming smoother, more persuasive. We have to make her see it's for the best. For everyone. For her own good. Hearing it all again in my head. The toast in my mouth turned to cardboard. This wasn't just a cash flow problem. This was a 5-alarm fire. And they saw my home, Arthur's sanctuary, as nothing more than a fire extinguisher. Mark's proposal on the porch hadn't been a casual thought bubble. It had been the opening salvo in a planned campaign. I pushed my chair back from the table, the legs scraping loudly on the pine floor. I'm going for a walk, I announced to no one in particular. The path through the woods was my refuge. The sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, dappling the forest floor. I breathed in the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A smell of permanence, of cycles, of things that endured. I ran my hand over the rough bark of a towering white pine that had been here long before Arthur. Long before any of us. He used to say the trees were the real owners of this land, we were just temporary guardians. Had I raised children who understood nothing of guardianship? Who saw a forest and only counted the board feet? When I returned, the tension had shifted. Richard was sitting on the porch with Kat and Mark. He was talking in a low, soothing murmur, one hand on Kat's shoulder. All I'm saying is, your mother is from a different generation. He was saying, and he fell silent as I approached. Though not quickly enough. They don't understand the pressures. The world isn't as simple as it was when Arthur bought this place for a song. He turned to me, his expression all sympathy. Just discussing the economy. Eleanor, frightening, isn't it? It can be, I said, my voice level. Later that afternoon, Kat found me in the garden, where I was pulling weeds from around my tomato plants. She knelt beside me, her designer jeans getting smudged with dirt. For a moment, she was my little girl again, the one who used to follow me around, collecting smooth stones and ladybugs in a little glass jar. Maman, she started, her voice soft and full of practiced vulnerability. About what Mark said, he's just worried. About me, about Chloe. He sees that big, empty point of land and all he can think about is how it could protect us. There are other ways to feel protected. Catherine, I said, not looking at her, yanking a stubborn thistle from the earth. But not like this. You don't understand the pressure. To keep up, everything is so expensive. Dad wouldn't have wanted us to struggle. He would have wanted us to be happy. Not sentimental. I finally stopped and turned to her. My gardening gloves covered in dirt. I looked into her eyes, searching for the daughter I knew and finding a stranger. Her face beautiful and strained. Her eyes reflecting a hunger I couldn't satisfy. Your father's happiness was this place, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was the sound of the wind in the pines, the reflection of the moon on the water. It was knowing his children and their children would have this sanctuary to come to. Whole and untouched. He didn't build it to be sold off in pieces to pay for a car or a kitchen renovation. He built it to last. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees with a series of sharp, angry pats. It's not just a kitchen, she said, her voice cold. It's my life, my career, and you don't get to judge it from up here in your perfect, debt-free castle. She turned and walked away, leaving me kneeling in the dirt. The sun was warm on my back, but I felt a deep, profound chill settle into my bones. The lines had been drawn, and I was standing on one side, utterly and completely alone. Of course, the battle lines have been drawn, and the air at the cottage has grown thin and cold. Now, the seeds of resentment, so carefully planted, begin to be watered by a master manipulator. Here is part 3 of The Cedar Sanctuary, continuing directly from the end of the previous section. Part 3, The Poison of Persuasion. After Catherine stormed away, a fragile truce settled over the cottage, the kind that feels more like a ceasefire than peace. We moved around each other with a careful, brittle politeness. Meals became exercises in avoiding eye contact. The easy laughter that used to echo off the cedar walls was gone, replaced by forced small talk that withered and died in the tense air. Mark spent his days on the phone, pacing the narrow strip of beach where the signal was strongest. His conversations a low, urgent hum. Liam became a ghost, slipping out of rooms whenever anyone else entered, the melancholy chords from his guitar drifting from the woods like a constant, quiet lament. It was in this vacuum that Richard began his work. He was a master of the quiet word. The casual observation dropped like a stone into a still pond, its ripples spreading farther than you'd think possible. I watched him, my brother-in-law, move between my children like a battlefield medic administering poison instead of morphine. He found Kat first, sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in a cashmere cardigan despite the afternoon warmth. She was staring blankly at the lake, her perfect Instagram life momentarily forgotten. Richard sat not beside her, but on the porch railing in front of her, forcing her to look up at him. She doesn't understand, does she? He began, his voice a soft murmur of sympathy. Kat just shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Of course she doesn't, Richard continued, pressing his advantage. Eleanor is a wonderful woman, but she's from another time. Her world is smaller, safer. She sees this place as a memory box. She doesn't see it for what it is. And what's that? Kat whispered. A lifeline, Richard said, his eyes gleaming. Your lifeline. I was talking to a friend in real estate. Just hypothetically, of course. A developer from Toronto is buying up properties on this side of the lake. They're paying astronomical sums. Enough to wipe out every debt. Enough to buy a beautiful home in the city. Enough to secure Chloe's education and your future for the next 30 years. Arthur? Arthur was a practical man. He would have wanted his family to have that lifeline. Sentiment is a luxury, my dear. Security is a necessity. He let the words hang in the air. A beautiful, tempting mirage. He had given her anger a righteous cause, transforming her greed into a noble quest for her family's security. He was reframing her father's legacy from one of preservation to one of provision. His approach with Liam was different, more surgical. He found him in the living room that evening, hunched over the old upright piano, his fingers tracing a melody full of unresolved chords. The room was dark, save for a single lamp that cast long shadows on the walls, making the taxidermy pheasant on the mantel look like a lurking predator. That's beautiful, son, Richard said, startling him. Liam's hands dropped from the keys as if he'd been burned. You have a real gift. A shame you've never had a proper studio to let it breathe. Liam shrugged, staring at the yellowed ivory keys. Dad wasn't big on artistic pursuits. He wanted me to be an engineer. Arthur was a good man, but he saw the world in straight lines and right angles. Richard said, wandering over to the fireplace, running a hand over the cool fieldstone. He didn't always appreciate things that were abstract. Your talent, for instance, it needs a real investment to flourish. Professional equipment, sound engineering, marketing, that takes capital. He turned from the fireplace, his face earnest in the dim light. A place like this, it's a beautiful memory. But it could also fund 1,000 dreams. It could fund your dream, Liam, a real career, the kind of success that no one could ignore. He didn't need to say, the kind of success your father would have finally respected. It was hanging there in the silence between them, a potent and irresistible poison. He was offering my son a way to rewrite his own history. To finally win the approval of a ghost. The effects of his campaign became terrifyingly clear over the next few days. The family's approach shifted from individual, emotional pleas to a unified, logical assault. It was strategic, coordinated. At dinner on the final night of the long weekend, they presented their case. It was Mark who spoke first. His tone no longer desperate, but confident, as if he were leading a boardroom presentation. He had a spreadsheet printed out. "Eleanor, we've been looking at this from the wrong perspective," he began, passing a copy to me. "This isn't about getting rid of the cottage. It's about diversifying a family asset that is currently underperforming. The property tax alone is astronomical. By leveraging a small, non-essential parcel, we can create a capital fund that would generate passive income for the entire family for decades to come." I looked at the sheet of paper. It was filled with columns and figures. Words like liquidity, projections, and ROI. They had managed to strip mine the soul from this place and render it down to a set of cold, hard numbers. Then it was Kat's turn. Her voice was smooth, controlled, filled with the persuasive empathy she used on her followers. "Maman, we want to honor Dad's legacy. And the best way to do that is to ensure his family is not just surviving, but thriving. A legacy isn't just a piece of land, it's a successful, happy family. This would allow Liam to pursue his music. It would secure our home. It would pay for Chloe's university outright. Isn't that a better legacy than just trees?" I looked at Liam. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He stared at his plate, picking at his food. "It would be a big help, Mom," he mumbled, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. "A real chance." I felt the walls of the room closing in, the crackling of the fire in the hearth. A sound that had always brought me comfort now sounded like a hungry, devouring mouth. The faces of my children, illuminated by the warm light, looked like the faces of strangers. They were a board of directors, and I was the lone dissenting voice standing in the way of their corporate takeover. I looked across the table at Richard. He was watching me, his expression neutral, but his eyes held a flicker of triumph. He had armed them. He had given them the words, the strategy, the justification. He had turned my children against the very heart of their own history. "I need some air," I said, my voice thin. I stood up from the table, my legs unsteady. I walked out onto the porch and into the cool, dark night. I stood there, wrapping my arms around myself, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. It was the same sound I'd listened to for 50 years. But tonight, for the first time, it didn't sound like peace. It sounded like a slow, relentless erosion. Of course, the campaign of persuasion has failed. And now, cloaked in the sacred tradition of a family holiday, the final assault begins. This is the point of no return. Here is part 4 of The Cedar Sanctuary. Continuing from the quiet erosion of the previous chapter. Part 4, The Thanksgiving Ultimatum. The 2 months between the long weekend and Thanksgiving were a study in cold silence. The phone calls from Kat became infrequent. And when they did happen, they were brief and superficial, brittle with a strained cheerfulness that was worse than her anger. They were giving me space. I knew it was a tactic, a strategic withdrawal to let Richard's poison do its work. I spent the autumn alone. The vibrant reds and yellows of the maples outside my window a stark contrast to the gray landscape of my heart. The cottage, my sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. When they arrived for Thanksgiving weekend, they came as a united front. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose that felt rehearsed. They brought expensive pies from a city bakery, as if to prove they no longer needed my homemade ones. They complimented the way I decorated with autumn gourds and branches. Their words smooth and polished and utterly meaningless. It was the politeness of strangers, a courtesy afforded to a difficult business associate, not a mother. The day of the Thanksgiving dinner, I moved through the kitchen in a fog of memory and dread. I prepared the turkey the way Arthur had always loved it, stuffed with sage and apple. I polished my mother's silver, its weight familiar and comforting in my hands. Each ritual was a quiet prayer, a desperate attempt to summon the ghosts of happier Thanksgivings to my defense. I was trying to remind them of who we were, of the love that had been baked into the very walls of this place. But their eyes were empty of the past. They were fixed solely on the future, a future that did not include me in it. We sat down at the long harvest table. The same table Arthur had built from a fallen oak on the property. The turkey, golden and perfect, sat in the center. The candlelight danced on their faces, creating masks of warmth that hid the coldness beneath. Richard, who had positioned himself in Arthur's chair at the head of the table, raised his glass. A toast, he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. To family, the most important investment any of us will ever have. And to the future, and the difficult but necessary decisions we make to secure it. He looked directly at me. To Eleanor, for building a legacy strong enough to support us all. It felt like an epitaph. My children raised their glasses, their gazes skittering away from mine. Liam's hand was trembling slightly. The meal was an agonizing pantomime of normalcy. We passed the mashed potatoes and the gravy. We talked about the weather. Chloe spoke about her university classes. But her words were rushed, her eyes pleading with me to pretend along with them. Every clink of a fork on a plate, every polite request to pass the salt, was amplified in the vast, silent spaces between us. I was presiding over the loneliest meal of my life, surrounded by the people I loved most. The moment came after the main course plates were cleared. Just before the pie, the air grew still, pregnant with anticipation. This was it. Mark cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. He reached down beside his chair and produced not a spreadsheet, but a slim, professional-looking folder bound in dark blue leather. He slid it across the polished surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of my plate. It looked like a funeral program. Eleanor, he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. This was business. We know our previous conversations were emotional, so we wanted to present this in the clearest way possible. We had a lawyer draft a formal proposal. It outlines a plan to sell the property to a numbered corporation that has already made a very generous preliminary offer. It details the creation of a family trust, with disbursements to be managed by a third-party firm. It's all in there. Clean, professional, the best possible outcome for everyone. I stared at the folder. The gold embossing of the law firm's crest seemed to mock the rustic simplicity of the room. This was the ultimate violation, bringing the cold, bloodless language of contracts and corporations into this sacred space. I didn't need to open it. I could feel the soulless finality of it through the leather. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my hands flat on the table. I looked at each of them. At Mark's hard, impatient face. At Liam, who was staring at his own hands as if he'd never seen them before. And at Catherine, my daughter, her expression a mask of nervous resolve. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. What do you mean, no? Mark snapped, his professional veneer cracking. Did you even look at the offer? Eleanor, this is 7 figures. This is life-changing money. It is not my life I wish to change, I replied, my voice gaining strength. This cottage, this land, is not for sale. It is not an asset. It is a home. It is a promise I made to your father. My answer is no. A terrible silence fell. Catherine stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. I could see the future she had built in her mind, the debts erased, the sponsorships secured, the triumphant social media posts, all of it turning to smoke before her very eyes. Her face, which had been tight with resolve, began to crumble. I don't think you understand. Maman, she said, her voice dangerously soft. We're not asking anymore. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. The candlelight flickered in her eyes, and in their depths, I saw not my daughter, but a desperate, cornered stranger. We have all talked, she said, her gaze sweeping over her husband, her brother, her uncle, and we are all in agreement. We love you, but your attachment to this place, it's not healthy. It is clouding your judgment. She took a deep breath, and the final, unthinkable words came out, calm and practiced, as if she had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. Then maybe it's time you moved into a managed care facility. Something closer to the city. With proper support. This property is too much for you to handle. And clearly, we need to be the ones making decisions for the family's future now. The air left my lungs. The sounds of the room, the crackling fire, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, all faded into a dull, rushing roar. A managed care facility. A home. They were not just trying to take my house. They were trying to take my life. To label me as incompetent. To pack me away like a piece of old furniture that no longer fit their decor. It was the ultimate betrayal. The ultimate act of violence. Wrapped in the language of love and concern. I looked at their faces. Waiting for someone to protest. For someone to say she had gone too far. But there was nothing. Mark nodded in grim agreement. Richard looked on with a placid, almost bored expression. And Liam, my son Liam, just closed his eyes. Surrendering completely. In that moment, the family I had spent a lifetime building died. And I was left alone in the ruins. No one spoke. The threat, the suggestion of a managed care facility, hung in the air. Sucking all the oxygen from the room. It was an atom bomb of a word. And we were all now living in its radioactive fallout. I watched them, my family, their faces illuminated in the flickering candlelight. And saw the faint, ugly flush of victory in their eyes. They had played their final card. And they believed they had won. My body began to move before my mind did. With a strange, detached calm, I stood up and began to clear the table. My hands were steady as I scraped the remnants of our Thanksgiving feast onto a single plate. The half-eaten turkey, the congealed gravy, the scattered cranberries, it all looked like the debris of a terrible accident. They watched me, unnerved by my silence, by the absence of the tears or the rage they had expected. One by one, they mumbled their excuses and retreated from the room, leaving me alone with the ghosts and the wreckage. I did not sleep that night. Sleep was an impossible country I could no longer visit. Instead, I wandered through the dark, silent cottage, a ghost in my own home. The embers in the fireplace glowed a dull, dying red. I padded across the cold pine floorboards in my bare feet, my hand trailing along the rough, familiar walls. Every object was a memory. And every memory was now tainted. I stopped at Arthur's old writing desk in the corner of the great room. I ran my fingers over the deep grooves and coffee cup rings that mapped the surface like an old chart of his life. How many hours had he sat here, sketching out plans for the boathouse, paying the bills, writing letters to his children at university, letters filled with a father's fierce, unconditional love? Did they remember any of that? Or had their memories been wiped clean to make room for the cold calculus of their own needs? I sank into his old leather armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of him, of pipe tobacco and wood smoke and something that was just Arthur. The house was so quiet I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart. I curled into the chair, pulling my knees to my chest. And in the profound, crushing loneliness of that moment, a memory I had long kept buried surfaced with the force of a tidal wave. The smell was not of pine, but of antiseptic. The sound was not the cry of a loon, but the quiet, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Arthur was propped up in the hospital bed, his strong, capable hands looking frail and papery against the starched white sheets. The cancer had taken so much, but it had not taken the clarity from his eyes. He knew his time was short. He had gripped my hand, his hold surprisingly strong. "Ellie," he'd rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Listen to me." I had leaned in close, my heart breaking. "The kids," he'd said, pausing to gather his breath. "They're good kids, Ellie, but they have a hunger in them. A modern hunger. They see what we built here." He squeezed my hand, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing the lake right there in that sterile room. "They see all of it. And they don't see the work. The splinters. The 50 years of scrimping and saving. They just see the price tag." A single tear had escaped his eye, and I had wiped it away. "Don't let them sell their own history, Ellie," he'd pleaded, his voice gaining a sudden, urgent strength. "This land, it's the only thing that will ever tell them who they really are. It's their anchor. They just don't know it yet. Promise me you'll be its guardian. Promise me you'll protect it. Even from them." I had looked into the eyes of the man I had loved my entire adult life. And I had made a sacred vow. "I promise, Arthur." I'd choked out. "Always." He had closed his eyes then, a look of peace settling on his face. His final duty discharged. The memory receded, leaving me shivering in the dark, cold cottage. But something had shifted. The grief, so sharp and suffocating, had not disappeared, but it had crystallized. It had hardened into a single, sharp point of purpose. I was not just a victim. I was not just a heartbroken mother. I was the guardian of a promise. Arthur hadn't been a sentimental fool, he had been a prophet. He had seen the rot starting even then and had entrusted me. And me alone, to stop it. I sat there in his chair for what felt like hours, watching the dark gray of the sky slowly soften into the pale blue of dawn. The first rays of sun angled through the tall pines, piercing the darkness of the room. A new day, un nouveau jour. The light didn't just illuminate the room, it illuminated the path forward. A narrow, cold, and lonely path, but it was there. My despair was gone, burned away by the rising sun, and in its place was a resolve as hard and clear as diamond. When the family began to surface, drawn downstairs by the smell of coffee, they found me in the kitchen. I was dressed, my hair was brushed, and I was moving with a calm, deliberate energy that seemed to unnerve them more than any argument could. I poured coffee into mugs without a tremor in my hand. Kat approached me first, her face a mask of cautious concern. "Maman, are you all right?" I turned from the counter to face them all. They stood there in a small, guilty-looking huddle, a firing squad waiting for the condemned to speak their last words. I looked at each of them, my gaze steady and unreadable. The fear was gone, the hurt was gone. There was only a great, silent calm. "I've thought about what you said," I said, my voice even and measured. "All of it." I saw the flicker of relief in their eyes. They thought they had broken me. "I will consider your proposal." The collective sigh in the room was almost silent. But I felt it, a gust of wind from a storm that believed it had passed. Mark and Catherine exchanged a triumphant glance. Liam finally looked up at me, his eyes full of a pathetic, grateful hope. They believed they had won. They had no idea that I had just begun to fight the family left on Thanksgiving Monday in a convoy of self-congratulation. Their goodbyes were a performance of magnanimous pity. Kat hugged me tightly, her cheek brushing mine, and whispered, "Take all the time you need. Maman, we know it's a big decision." Mark gave my shoulder a patronizing squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor, for everyone." They thought they were giving me time to grieve the loss of my home. In reality, they were giving me the time I needed to save it. I watched their cars disappear down the long gravel drive, the dust settling in their wake. A profound silence descended upon the cottage. But it was different now. It was not the silence of loneliness, it was the silence of liberation. The air felt lighter. I walked back inside, the screen door closing with a soft click. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again in my own house. I was no longer a defender. I was an architect. The next morning, I was up before the sun. A list written in Arthur's firm, clear script beside the telephone. My first call was to David McLeod, our family lawyer for over 40 years. A man whose friendship with Arthur was as old and solid as the granite bedrock beneath the cottage. "Eleanor," his voice boomed through the receiver. I was half expecting a call. "How did you survive the holiday?" There was no judgment in his voice, only a deep, weary knowing. David had seen the kids grow up. He had seen the modern hunger Arthur had spoken of. I took a deep breath. "David," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I need your help to give the cottage away." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for me to hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in my hall and the faint hum of his office in the city. "Give it away?" he repeated, his voice cautious. "Not sell?" "No," I said firmly, "never sell. I want to donate it. All of it. The house, the land, everything. I want it protected, David, permanently." I explained my plan, my voice never wavering. I told him about the National Conservation Trust, about the promise I'd made to Arthur. He listened without interruption. When I finished, there was another silence. Then, I heard him let out a long, slow breath. "Well, I'll be damned, Eleanor," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Arthur always said you were the toughest person he ever knew. Send me the preliminary documents. I'll make sure it's ironclad. It would be my honor." My next call was to my financial advisor. I explained that I would be relocating and needed to liquidate a portion of my portfolio to fund the move and my subsequent living expenses. We spoke of investments, capital gains, and wire transfers. The conversation was clinical, efficient, and deeply empowering. It was a stark reminder that I was not the frail, incompetent woman my children had tried to paint me as. I was a woman with resources, with agency, and with a mind that was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. 3 days later, a sensible Subaru with a government plate bumped its way up the driveway. A woman in her 50s with a kind, weathered face and practical hiking boots stepped out. She was not a developer with slick brochures, but a biologist named Ms. Albright from the National Conservation Trust of Canada. "Mrs. Vance," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "it's a privilege to be here. I've seen the topographical maps, of course, but they don't do it justice." For the next 2 hours, we walked the land. She didn't talk about property value, she talked about biodiversity. She pointed out the rare ferns growing near the creek, the nesting grounds of the loons in the quiet bay, the old-growth pines that stood like silent sentinels on the ridge. She saw the land exactly as Arthur had, as a living, breathing entity, a treasure to be protected, not a resource to be plundered. We concluded our tour on the wide, sun-drenched dock. "With this donation," she said, her eyes sweeping across the pristine shoreline, "you'd be creating one of the largest protected freshwater wetlands in the entire region. It would be a legacy for generations of Canadians." Legacy. There was that word again. But coming from her, it sounded pure and true. Back in the cabin, she spread the official donation and endowment papers on the harvest table, right where Mark's leather-bound ultimatum had lain just days before. The language was not of profit and loss, but of preservation and perpetuity. I read the clause David had insisted upon. A single, elegant sentence that legally designated the property as the Arthur Vance Memorial Sanctuary. I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. With a steady, deliberate stroke, I signed my name. I signed away the multi-million-dollar asset my children coveted. And in doing so, I fulfilled the most important promise of my life. A profound sense of peace washed over me. A peace I hadn't felt since Arthur died. The weight was gone. My duty was done. That evening, I packed. It didn't take long. My new life would not be defined by a multitude of possessions. I took one suitcase. Into it, I folded my warmest sweaters and most practical shoes. Then came the treasures. The framed photograph from our wedding. Arthur looking impossibly young and handsome. A small, smooth stone Chloe had given me when she was 5. A bundle of Arthur's letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. And finally, a small, hand-carved wooden loon he had made for me one winter, its form worn smooth from years of my touch. I closed the suitcase and clicked the latches shut. That was it. My whole life, the parts that truly mattered, contained in a single bag. I took one last walk down to the dock as twilight bled across the sky. I stood where Arthur and I had stood 1,000 times, watching the stars begin to prick the deep violet canopy. This place had never been mine to own. I was only ever its guardian. And now, my watch was over. I was no longer the lady of the manor, waiting for the barbarians at the gate. I was free. I turned my back on the lake and walked towards the cabin, its warm lights beckoning me for the last time. Not with a sense of loss, but with the quiet, triumphant satisfaction of a promise kept. I was not there to see it. Of course, David, my lawyer, pieced the story together for me later from the frantic, hysterical phone calls he received that day. But in my mind's eye, I can see it all with perfect, cinematic clarity. They arrived 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, on a crisp, brilliant Saturday in late October. The last of the fiery maple leaves clung stubbornly to the branches, and the air had the clean, sharp bite of impending winter. They came in Catherine's white Range Rover, the tires crunching on the gravel with an air of arrogant finality. They were dressed for a victory lunch, not a visit to the cottage. Mark was in a tailored sports coat, Catherine in expensive-looking leather boots and a cream-colored cashmere sweater. Even Liam, dragged along for the occasion, had put on a clean shirt. They were in high spirits, laughing as they got out of the car. They were expecting to meet a high-end real estate agent, the one Richard had assured them was handling the discreet inquiry from the Toronto developer. They were talking about closing dates and capital gains, their voices echoing in the quiet air. They saw the green work truck parked near the entrance to the long drive but paid it little mind, likely assuming it was a surveyor or a landscaper. As they approached the cabin, however, they must have felt the first prickle of unease. The porch was empty. The cheerful welcome mat was gone. There was no scent of coffee brewing. No sign of life within. The cottage, which had always felt like it was waiting for them with open arms, now looked silent, shuttered, and strangely impersonal. Waiting for them on the top step was not me, but a man in a crisp, dark green uniform with a National Conservation Trust patch on the sleeve. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm, patient demeanor that would soon be tested. "Good morning," he said, his voice polite but firm. "Can I help you?" Mark, ever the man in charge, stepped forward. "We're the Vance family. We're here to meet a real estate agent. I believe my mother, Eleanor Vance, was expecting us." The man in the uniform nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, I'm Ben Harrison, the sanctuary steward for this property. I'm afraid Mrs. Vance is no longer here. She left 2 weeks ago." A confused silence fell over them. "Sanctuary steward?" Kat repeated, the words tasting strange in her mouth. "What are you talking about?" "This is our family cottage. I understand it has been for a very long time," Mr. Harrison said, his tone still courteous. "However, as of October 18th, this entire 50-acre property was formally and irrevocably donated by Mrs. Eleanor Vance to the National Conservation Trust of Canada. It is now a protected wilderness area. I'm the on-site manager." For a moment, they simply stared at him, the information failing to compute. It was like he had just started speaking to them in a foreign language. It was Kat who broke first. A choked, disbelieving laugh escaped her lips. That's ridiculous. This is a mistake. There must be some kind of mistake. Our mother, she couldn't. I can assure you, there is no mistake," Mr. Harrison replied, pulling a folded document from his breast pocket. "This is a copy of the legally registered deed of gift. It's a matter of public record." The sound of a power drill suddenly split the air, making them all jump. They turned to see 2 men in work clothes finishing the installation of a massive new sign at the head of the driveway. It was carved from a single, enormous slab of cedar, the lettering deep and official. Mr. Harrison gestured towards it. "The permanent dedication sign was just installed this morning," he said. They walked towards it like sleepwalkers, drawn by a force of horrific fascination. And then they saw it. The Arthur Vance Memorial Sanctuary. This land is protected in perpetuity for the enjoyment of the public. A gift to the people of Canada from Eleanor Vance in loving memory of her husband. That's when the chaos erupted. Catherine's phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the gravel. Mark's face turned a blotchy, furious red. "Get David McLeod on the phone," he roared at Kat. "Now. This is illegal. This is elder abuse. An old woman can't just give away a multi-million-dollar asset. She's clearly incompetent. We'll contest it. We'll sue. She told us," Liam whispered, his face pale with a dawning, horrified understanding. He sank onto a nearby boulder, his head in his hands. "She said she would consider it." Richard, who had been silent until now, stood staring at the sign, his face a mask of disbelief that was slowly hardening into pure, impotent fury. His perfect, long-simmering revenge had not only failed, it had been turned against him, immortalizing the very man he despised. "I'm afraid any legal challenge would be fruitless," Mr. Harrison said, his voice cutting calmly through their panic. Mrs. Vance's legal counsel, Mr. McLeod, oversaw the entire transaction. She underwent a full cognitive assessment by a geriatric specialist as part of the due diligence. "The donation is ironclad." Kat, her hands shaking, was frantically trying to call me. She got my new voicemail. A simple, clear recording. "You have reached Eleanor Vance. I will be unavailable for the foreseeable future. If this is a personal matter, please write to me at the following post office box." A post office box. An anonymous, untraceable address. She was a ghost. Mark was now shouting into his own phone, presumably at his lawyer, his voice cracking with desperation. "What do you mean it's perfectly legal? What do you mean charitable donations are encouraged by the government? Find a loophole." Mr. Harrison waited for a lull in the shouting. "My purpose here this morning," he said, his patience finally wearing thin, "is to inform you that the trust is officially taking possession of the property. The locks on the cabin will be changed on Monday morning. You have 48 hours to remove any personal effects you may have left inside. After that time, this will become a public access park. I'm sorry for your loss." He wasn't sorry. His words were a death sentence. They stared at him, then at the silent, impassive cabin, then at the beautiful, damning sign. It finally hit them. They hadn't just lost the money. They had lost the cottage itself. The place was no longer theirs to sell. No longer theirs to even visit as a private family retreat. Their history, their identity, the very heart of their social standing, had been given away to strangers, to hikers, to birdwatchers, to the public, to everyone. Their great betrayal had been met with an absolute, unbreakable, and beautifully elegant consequence. They were left standing at the gate of their own history, locked out for good. Of course, after the storm comes the quiet. This is the final chapter. The peaceful dawn after a long and painful night, where we see the true shape of Eleanor's victory and the first fragile shoots of hope. Here is the conclusion. Part 8 of The Cedar Sanctuary. Part 8. Sunrise over the sanctuary. My new life began with the sea. My apartment is not large, but it is filled with a soft, gray light that I have come to love. It's a simple place in Oak Bay, just outside of Victoria, with a single, enormous window that looks out over the vast, restless expanse of the Pacific. The air here smells of salt and rain and seaweed, a world away from the scent of pine and lake water that I had known my entire life. The sound that wakes me now is not the cry of a loon, but the lonely, mournful call of a distant foghorn and the sharp chatter of gulls. The few treasures I brought with me are arranged on the mantelpiece: the wedding photograph, Chloe's smooth stone, the carved wooden loon. They are not ghosts here. In the clean, uncluttered space of my new beginning, they feel like anchors, reminding me of a love that was real, a foundation that was true, even if the house built upon it had to be abandoned. My mornings have found their own gentle rhythm. I wake with the sun, make a pot of strong tea, and sit in the armchair by the window, watching the ferries glide like silent, graceful giants across the water towards the mainland. It is a quiet life, a peaceful life, a life that is entirely my own. This morning, there was a letter waiting for me on the small kitchen table, forwarded from my post office box. The envelope was slightly crumpled, the address written in Liam's familiar, untidy script. It had taken a month to find me. I held it in my hands for a long time. The paper a tangible link to a world I had worked so hard to leave behind. I thought about not opening it. I thought about dropping it, unread, into the recycling bin, but I didn't. With a deep breath, I slit the envelope open. The letter inside was short, the page stained in a few places as if from rain, or perhaps tears. "Mom," it began, "I don't know if you'll ever get this. I don't even know if I have the right to write it. I don't have a return address because I'm not asking for a reply. I just wanted to say that I see it now. All of it. After we were told to leave, I went back to the city, but I couldn't stand it. A few days later, I drove back up north. I parked on the side of the road and I walked onto the land. Onto the sanctuary. It was open. The gate was unlocked. There were families there. Mom. Strangers. They were walking the trails, smiling, taking pictures by the lake. I saw a little boy pointing at a blue heron on the dock, our dock. And they all looked so happy. And they had no idea. I sat in the woods for hours. I thought about Dad. I thought about what he built. And I finally understood what you were protecting. It wasn't a house. It was a feeling that we sold for nothing. There's no excuse for what I did, for what I let happen. My silence was a betrayal. And I will live with that for the rest of my life. I am so sorry. I hope you are somewhere peaceful. I hope you are happy. Liam. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the windowsill. There were no tears. The time for tears was over. There was only a deep, quiet ache, the phantom pain of a limb long since amputated. In his letter, I saw the first flicker of the man his father had always hoped he would become. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of hope. I picked up my warm mug of tea and looked out the window. The sun was breaking through the morning fog, casting a brilliant, shimmering path across the water. The light was silver and gold and impossibly beautiful. I had lost my children, but I had saved my husband's soul. And in doing so, I had saved my own. Say Assie, it is enough. Far away, 3,000 miles to the east, A young family from Toronto steps out of their car at the entrance to a public park. They have come to escape the city for a day. To show their small daughter what a real forest looks like. They walk down a well-maintained trail. The air cool and smelling of cedar and damp earth. They come to a lookout point. A stunning vista of a clear, gray lake surrounded by the rugged, windswept beauty of the Canadian Shield. There is a small, bronze plaque on a granite boulder. The father lifts his daughter up so she can see it. What's it say, Daddy? She asks. He smiles, tracing the words with his finger. It says, "The Arthur Vance Memorial Sanctuary," he reads. It says this is a gift. A place to be shared. A place to be treasured. The little girl doesn't understand the words. But she understands the feeling. She sees the vast, quiet beauty spread out before her. And she laughs. A sound of pure, uncomplicated joy that echoes out over the water. It is a sound of peace. A sound of gratitude. A sound that proves a promise was kept. The heart of the matter. We often think of legacy as something tangible we leave behind for our family, a home, a business, or a sum of money. But what happens when the family we love becomes the greatest threat to the values we cherish most? Eleanor's story is a powerful, albeit painful, exploration of this very question. It reminds us that a true legacy isn't measured in dollars or acres, but in promises kept, in principles honored, and in the quiet courage it takes to protect something sacred from the people you thought you were saving it for. In a world that constantly pressures us to monetize our passions and put a price tag on our history, this story is a declaration that some things are not for sale. Setting boundaries, especially with those we love, is one of the hardest things we can do. It can feel like an act of betrayal. But as Eleanor discovered, it is often an act of profound self-respect and ultimate preservation. It's the difficult acknowledgement that love cannot be a blank check for disrespect. And that enabling destructive behavior is not a kindness. Her final choice was not just about saving a piece of land, it was about reclaiming her own soul and honoring a love that deserved to be remembered for its strength, not exploited for its assets. This story speaks to the silent guardian in all of us. The part that knows what truly matters. We've all faced moments where we had to choose between keeping a fragile peace and protecting our own sanctuary. What does legacy truly mean to you? And have you ever had to fight for it? Please, share your story in the comments below. Partagez votre histoire. Take good care of yourselves and each other.